So welcome. This is our first week of For the Life of the World, which is going to be a Lenten book study on the book of the same title by Alexander Smayman, who is the American Orthodox priest, writer, and professor. I wanted to start the class first off just looking at the syllabus, which I sent out this morning. So I'm going to share my screen. And where is it? Here it is. So if you have your, if you're on this email list, you would have received this morning. I know a couple of you weren't, and I've added you, so you'll start getting these. And I typically email on Thursday and then a reminder on Sunday. But this class will go throughout Lent. These are the Zoom instructions. And then you can see here, I've put the reading for each week. So we'll basically be reading a chapter a week, except for our last class, which will be on Palm Sunday, and we'll look at 6 and 7 that week. The readings are relatively short, and so hopefully this isn't too daunting a task. I know sometimes I've chosen books in the past that are a little too long for 6 weeks, so I hope this is more welcomed. But I wanted to speak to, before we get started, to kind of the format of this class. And my hope is just to walk through each chapter with you and kind of reflect on what Smayman is talking about. And then we can kind of open up that discussion as we go along. There's not going to be a kind of period at the end. We'll have questions at the end, but I want you to interrupt me or to bring up questions as I'm talking along. I don't want this to be just me kind of lecturing on a book. I want it to be more of a conversation. So while I'll be guiding the conversation, please feel free to interrupt me at will. Another point I wanted to make was that, can you raise your hand if you have a book? Okay, so I see a couple hands aren't raised. There are 10 books coming in tomorrow, and I know that 5 of you have reserved copies, but there are 5 more available. And so if you'd like those books, just call Susan at the Palmacia office, and that's just the regular number for Palmacia. My dog is trying to break into the room right now. She's so excited about Smayman. Hold on a second. Hey.
It's also available on Kindle.
Sorry about that. Life on Zoom. Okay.
Yeah.
Ed?
Yes, it's also available on Kindle if a person doesn't want to go into the church there.
Yeah, the ones in the church are available for free though. They don't need to be paid for.
Will, I bought one through the iBooks or whatever it is, so I know my name was listed as one of the 5 when I called last week, so that means somebody else can take the copy that I was going to get.
All righty, thank you. Thank you both. So yeah, so you can get it on Kindle if you'd like, or if you'd like one for free, they are available up at the church office, and those will be in tomorrow. I don't know what time, but they will be in tomorrow. So that's kind of just the preliminary logistics. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to who Alexander Smayman is, and then we'll get into the book. Smayman was born in September 13th, or on September 13th, 1921, and he was born in Estonia, but he grew up primarily in France. His family was Russian immigrants, and there was a huge community of Russian immigrants, specifically people of faith in Paris at the time. And so a lot of the kind of big names in 20th century Orthodox theology, primarily that were Russian, kind of lived in Paris. There was a lot of them teaching in Paris, and a lot of the theology from that time's coming out of that. Smayman taught in Paris from 1946 until 1951, and then in 1951 he moved to New York with his family. He moved to teach at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and that's where he was for that's where he was for the, hey, look, I'm doing something here, man. That's where he was for the, can y'all hear that? Yeah, she's going crazy behind me. I'm sorry about that. So he taught at St. Vladimir's for the rest of his career. And in 1962, he was made the dean of the seminary and basically carried that out until the end of his life. He died with cancer in 1983. And he is largely remembered as a writer around liturgical theology. That's not a phrase many of us are familiar with. It's not something that's taught in Protestant seminaries. But liturgical theology, has anyone worshiped at an Orthodox church? So I see a few of y'all. So if you've been to an Orthodox church, the whole service is liturgy. There is this rich liturgy. It's even more liturgical than a Catholic church would be. Everything is kind of orchestrated, and everything has a meaning, a point, and a purpose behind it. And there's a rich theology kind of wrapped up in the liturgy. And so Smayman's work largely focused on that, thinking through how the liturgy informs us of God, the story of God's relationship with humanity, and then all the kind of theological concepts we would consider. Smayman was considering how that is carried out through liturgy or through worship. He was also basically one of the main people responsible for the founding of the American Orthodox Church. So the Orthodox Church, or what's often called the Eastern Orthodox Church, are a group of loosely affiliated churches. So there's like the Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox Church. And in 1970, the American Orthodox Church was granted autocephaly, which essentially means that it was founded as an independent branch of the Orthodox Church. And Smayman was so involved in that and largely responsible for that happening. And one of the big things for Smayman in doing that was he wanted to create a branch of the Orthodox Church that wasn't based on ethnicity or nationality. Because, when we talk about Orthodox churches, it's the Greek Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church. And I remember in seminary, a good friend of mine converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and he joined the church. And he said one of the biggest barriers for him was that he went to a Greek Orthodox church, was that he wasn't Greek. And so as much as he was accepted and part of that community, he said it was really hard for him at times because he just didn't have that national or ethnic identity. And said he kind of felt like he had one foot in and one foot out. And so Smayman was trying to kind of counter that with the creation of the American Orthodox Church as a place where all ethnicities, all nationalities would be welcomed. And so that's another cool work of his. He wrote a ton, in addition to teaching and leading St. Vladimir's. He wrote a lot. This book that we're going to be reading is his most well-known. I think it's been translated into 11 different languages. It's a really widely read book, and I think it's one of the Orthodox books that kind of came outside the realm of Orthodox writing, or Orthodox communities, I should say. I'm real interested to hear what y'all thought about this book as we go on, but that's something to think about, is the relationship of this book within an Orthodox framework. He's speaking specifically to Orthodox Christians, but there's such rich theology that I think it kind of transcends denominations. I think there is a point to this. I think my dog had some coffee this morning. I think there's a richness to this that it spans kind of an ecumenical audience. It transcends its kind of Orthodox trappings, is what I wanted to say. So let's start and get into the book, but I wanted to start with a couple questions. I love to ask questions before we start, and I want to preface our conversation today with a couple questions. And so I wanted to ask y'all, particularly, how would you define faith or belief? That can be a short answer, it can be a longer answer, but I'm interested in how you define faith or belief. Don't be shy, this is a conversation.
I'd say trust.
Trust, okay. Thanks, Jane. Anyone else? Rob?
Yeah, one aspect of it that I think is big is a set of dogma or beliefs. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I grew up in the Reformed faith. I had neighbors who believed in the Catholic faith, and to me, that gets beyond my trust in God. But it's a, do I accept a certain uh, collection of teachings so I could be within the Reformed family of faith rather than, say, the Roman Catholic family of faith.
Thanks, Rob. The dogma, teachings, something that makes you belong. Marcia? You're
Okay, it's hard for
There you
me to get past Hebrews 11:1.
Well, do you want to say?
It's the things hoped for, the substance of things not seen.
Yeah, right. That's a good definition. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, a simple definition for faith would be you accept something as a belief with no proof.
Belief with no proof. Thanks. Anyone else? Faith or belief? How would you define it?
Will,
Yes.
silence as birds and lilies.
Say that again.
Silence as a bird or a lily.
Silent as a bird or a lily. Interesting. Thanks. Barbara?
I look at it as a choice.
A choice. Thanks. So I have a follow-up question. What role does the church have in faith? And what role does creation or the material world have in faith?
Could you say that again, please?
Sure. I'm asking, what is the role of the church and of the created world in faith? What role does the church or the creation or the created world or the material world have in faith, in our faith, in your faith?
Well, I think it is the church has a role to help reinforce and develop through common sharing of experiences, common questioning, a lot of what we're doing in the Sunday school class, a lot of, that in church. And as far as the material world, sometimes the material world gives us verification in a way of our beliefs and our things. I don't know exactly how to describe that more, but I guess verification, shared experiences, a emphasis and a continual thought process of, again, things not seen, things not proven by facts that we typically use.
Thanks, Cindy. Anyone else? What role does the church and or the created world have in your faith?
The church helps us understand creation's role. Was anybody outside yesterday?
I was outside all day.
Because creation was screaming at you how lucky we are to live in this place, what God has given us.
I agree. Thanks, Robert. Anyone else? All right, then I'm asking a lot of questions here, but I want to ask another one. It's a big one, but how would you define sin and how would you define salvation? There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm not asking for a theological definition, just how you personally would talk about sin or salvation or both.
Okay.
I guess I remember from catechisms, a sin is a separation from God. And I think salvation is God's gift to us if we believe in him to have eternal life.
Thanks, Betsy. Anyone else? Sin, salvation, how you would define it?
Well, I'm echoing somewhat, I think, what was just said. For me, sin has to do with alienation from people and God, and salvation has to do with a wholeness, a restoration, a oneness with all of creation.
Thanks, Bill. Anyone else before we move on? All righty. Well, I asked those things for a number of reasons. The first reason is it's Lent, right? And this is a season when we kind of are intentionally, more so than usual, taking time to pause, to reflect, to repent. And repent, remember, is essentially to turn around, to turn back towards God, and to prepare ourselves for the good news of resurrection on Easter. And so I hope in this season, this class is just one of the few things that the church can offer to help you in that journey. I also ask these questions because we're going to be reading a book by an Orthodox theologian, and I think the Orthodox oftentimes frame faith, belief, the church, creation, sin, salvation differently than we do as American Protestants, and specifically as Presbyterians. And so there isn't necessarily a right or wrong. It's just different traditions in how they speak about these topics. I do think that Smayman has a very unique view, and I think it's a really beautiful view. I tried to read this book once a year since I first read it. It's one of the few books. I'm trying to think of theology books that I think it's one of the only theology books I try to read once a year. It's definitely a top 5 personal favorite of mine. And I think it's because it's one of the books that makes me want to be a Christian more than I already do. It's a book that pushes me to think about my faith in new ways and to want to live deeper in my beliefs. Not in the sense of kind of an intellectual belief, but in the sense of carrying out my Christianity in all that I do. And so I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on that. But I picked this book not because it's written for Lent, but because I think it's such a beautiful book for Lent. Because I think if anything during Lent, we should be considering what our faith is and what our faith is calling us to. And so I hope that this book can kind of assist you in that work as we walk through Lent. So I'm going to pull up the handout I shared with you today. And I'm going to walk through. I'm not going to read through the preface. We're just going to kind of start with the book, chapter 1. Please interrupt me. I can't see you now that I'm sharing my screen. So just unmute yourself. So if you don't have a book, I've put the page number so you can return when you do get a book. And if you do have a book, feel free to open it or just follow along on the screen. So Smayman starts with this kind of what has now become a famous, hey, you've got to stop, buddy, I'm teaching. With this shh, no. So sorry.
Let your dog speak, Will.
I think she wants to participate. She's like abnormally crazy this morning. So anyhow, he starts with this this quote, "Man is what he eats," which is from Feuerbach, which I'm probably butchering there. But he kind of turns that on his head and says, yes, man is what he eats, but it's not in this kind of unchristian materialistic way. It's much more than that. And so you see here, I've got this quote from page 17, and I wonder, Bill Hull, if you'll read this first quote I have up on the screen.
Just from page 17.
Yes, sir.
Because it's showing up small on my screen. I'll read it from my paper. Man must eat in order to live. He must take the world into his body and transform it into himself. into flesh and blood. He is indeed that which he eats, and the whole world is presented as one all-embracing banquet table for man. And this image of the banquet remains throughout the whole of the Bible, the central image of life. It is the image of life at its creation, and also the image of life at its end and fulfillment, that you eat and drink at my table in my kingdom.
Thanks, Bill. So I think when I first read this, I remember, why is he starting with eating? And what's the point here? What's he getting at? It sounds beautiful, right? Man must eat in order to live. He must take the world into his body and transform it. He is indeed that which he eats, and the whole world is presented as one all-embracing banquet table for man. What he's getting at here, though, ultimately is desire. Smayman is talking about desire, and where is our desire coming from? And that desire being like eating, right? We have to eat to live. And so he's pushing us to this idea of what are those things that drive us? What are our desires, and how integral they are in our life? Robert, were you about to say something?
How do you like the line, for one who thinks food in itself is a source of life, eating is communion with the dying world? Never thought of it that way. It is communion with death. Food itself is dead. It is life that has died and must be kept in the refrigerator like a corpse.
Yeah, Smayman is got away with words, and that's a great part of this. Thanks for pointing out that. So the next quote I have is from page 18, and it's kind of him moving into what I was talking about with his point on desire. He says, I begin with this seemingly secondary theme of food, secondary from the standpoint of the great religious issues of our time, because the very purpose of this essay is to answer, if possible, the question of what life do we speak, what life do we preach, proclaim, and announce when, as Christians, we confess that Christ died for the life of the world? What life is both the motivation and the beginning and the goal of Christian mission? So again, he's speaking about desire and those drives that drive us and how integral they are into our life. And he's doing this because he wants to speak about Christianity not as a religious kind of entity or set of beliefs that are counter to life, but Christianity as life itself. And that's why on page 18 through 20, he makes this distinction between these kind of two sects of religion, right? There is the spiritualist and the activist. So you can think about the spiritualists as those that are more concerned about the experiential elements of faith. You know, they're about belief and the experience of God and the experience of being with God. And then there are the activists. And so those are that are involved in social justice initiatives, that are interested in carrying out God's will and the kind of material realities of life, of helping the poor, the widow, the orphan. And Smayman is making a distinction between those two, and saying these are kind of where Christianity falls by and large. And he's not saying one or the other is right or wrong, but that's where they fall. And he's making the point, though, that ultimately these do not suffice to cover Christianity as a whole, to cover what he calls real life. And so on page 21, he moved to this point to say that the distinctions between spiritual, material, between sacred and profane, between supernatural versus natural, are all false dichotomies and not biblical. And then there's this quote: God blesses everything he creates, and in biblical language, this means that he makes all creation the sign and means of his presence and wisdom, love, and revelation. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. So I want to stop sharing for a second and ask, how did y'all respond to this part of the book? Because he's making a distinction here, and he's saying there is no sacred, there is no profane. These are kind of false dichotomies that arise. and that the spiritual and the activist branches of the church do not fully get at what Christianity is. What thoughts come up in this, or what reflections did you have, Marcia?
I've been turning that over in my head, given the denomination's recent endorsement of the Matthew 25 community, which I would put squarely in the activist column.
Right.
And feeling, and I very much endorse that effort. And I felt like what he was saying was, yeah, as Nancy always says to me, yeah, but we should not forget the other side. And I guess he's making it a whole approach, but the other side of what's necessary to truly make us Christians. There is a spiritual part, which I'm anticipating he is going to tie to the liturgical a bit more.
Yeah, and I think his idea of liturgy expands beyond just what happens in church. The liturgy comes from a word that essentially means work of the people. Anyone else have any thoughts on what we've covered right now? Eating, these kind of dichotomies that exist, and him saying that there's not a sacred and there's not a profane. Do y'all agree, disagree? What thoughts come to mind? I'm interested to hear about this because it's integral to his overall kind of what he's doing in this book.
I'm interested in looking at eats, and he's going to make the analogy through that somehow. And you have heard the expression where a person gets very good at something, and it's said that, well, he just eats that up, like he does it very well. And is he going to switch into this somehow? I really would like to hear some of your opinions on other people's opinions on how far can you push this eating analogy to get it into the spiritual and etc. So that's what I'd like to know a little bit more about.
Well, and I think we'll get there, but I want to say it's not the spiritual. Smayman is not trying to Smayman is talking about life in its totality, and so he's trying to make the point that what he's saying isn't spiritual as opposed to like something that's material, or supernatural as opposed to natural, or sacred as opposed to profane. Because for him, creation is all endowed or created by God and endowed with God's presence in some way.
Will?
Yes.
I know that some of the people in this class are reading the same devotional that Bill and I read from Richard Rohr, and it links contemplation and activism, and its purpose is to get away from the dualistic thinking. So I see that being in the world today.
Thanks, Sybil. Yeah, so that's another good kind of dichotomy that often exists, is that dichotomy between contemplation or the life of the spirit and prayer and the life of activism. And so Richard Rohr is really big on combining those two. I think Smayman is trying to go even further and say there's something more than just those two as well.
Well, I don't know if I can answer your question well, but having read this book with you before, these are things that stuck out to me in this 19 and 20 page. The light God sent was his son. To me, this was good. The same light that had been shining undistinguished in the world's darkness all along, seen now in full brightness. We believe as well that Christ is present in any seeker after the truth. Christianity, however, in a profound sense.
Robert, I'm going to stop you because we're going to get to that in a second.
Okay, good.
You're jumping ahead. You're far ahead of us.
Well, I'm on page 19.
Yep. Well, I wanted to kind of stop with the eating and the dichotomies, but we'll move on because I think Robert's drawing us ahead, which is good. So back to my sharing of the screen. So Martin asked, where's he going? How far can he drag out this analogy? And so I said he's using eating as a kind of an analogy for desire. And so if you look on page on 21, I've got the quote right here. Man, you know what, Robert Mims, would you read this quote that's highlighted?
If I was unmuted. Man is a hungry being, but he is hungry for God. Behind all the hunger of our life is God. All desire is finally a desire for him. To be sure, man is not the only hungry being. All that something lives by eating. The whole creation depends on food. But the unique position of man in the something universe is that he alone is to bless God for the food and the life he receives from him. He alone is to respond to God's blessing with his blessing.
Thanks, Robert. So here's how he ties that analogy in. And so the eating is, it's twofold, right? It's a desire we have. We have a desire to eat, but it also, it instills us with life. And so he's trying to say that act of eating food is akin to what faith is essentially. And faith is twofold, right? It's something that keeps us alive, and not just biologically alive, but alive in the sense that we are living in a meaningful way, that we are living in a way that is fulfilling, that we are living in a way that is abundant. And the other part is we have a desire, right? St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And that's what he's saying here. Our hunger, the desire that we have, that kind of existential desire, is ultimately for God. And it might get misplaced on different things or misinterpreted, but ultimately it is for God. And so the point with the food, though, and I'm kind of hammering this on the head, but it's really important, is that Smayman is not saying that this is something that is going to make us spiritually happy, or that this is some kind of religious exercise that we have to do, but rather that this is integral to who we are and to what life is. And so we have to break out of this framework of Christianity as a religion to what Smayman is lifting up, is that Christianity is reality, in the sense that God created the world, God created us a specific way for specific things, and that is how we live out our faith. It's not simply within the strictures of the church or even the liturgy, but in the everyday existence of our life, our breathing, our eating, our going to work, our seeing friends, the way we treat others. Everything we do is encompassed in this. And so that was what he was trying to get across with this. There is no sacred, there is no profane, but rather that our life should be faithful in its completeness, in its entirety. Just as eating food is integral to who we are, living a fulfilled life in God is integral to kind of living in the way that God created us to be. So that's when he gets to this point about blessing, right? And there's this long quote I quoted. And if you have your book, I want you to turn to page 22, because this is probably the most important paragraph from what we'll go over today. And Marcia, I wonder if you would read the paragraph starts at the top of page 22, and I'll scroll down as we read it, because I've put it all in the notes as well. But if we're just going to read that entire first paragraph on page 22.
To name a thing, in other words, is to bless God for it and in it. And in the Bible, to bless God is not a religious or a cultic act, but is the very way of life. God blessed the world, blessed man, blessed the seventh day, that is time. And this means that he who filled all that exists with his love and goodness made all this very good. So the only natural, not supernatural, reaction of man to whom God gave this blessed and sanctified world is to bless God in return, to thank him, to see the world as he sees it, and in this act of gratitude and adoration, to know, name, and possess the world. All rational, spiritual, and other qualities of man, distinguishing him from other creatures, have their focus and ultimate fulfillment in this capacity to bless God, to know, so to speak, the meaning of the thirst and hunger that constitutes his life. Homo sapiens, Homo faber, yes, but first of all, Homo adorans. This first and basic definition of man is that he is the priest. He stands in the center of the world and unifies it in his act of blessing God, of both receiving the world from God and offering it to God. And by filling the world with his Eucharist, he transformed his life, the one that he receives from the world, into life in God, into communion with him. The world was created as the matter, the material of one all-embracing Eucharist, and man was created as the priest of this cosmic sacrament.
Thanks, Marcia. So there's a lot there. I would recommend today, when we're done with class, to reread this paragraph a couple times because it's essential to the entire book and to the whole project. So Smayman starts with this focus on eating, which is him equating essentially to desire. And now in this part, we get this kind of what I would say is his anthropology. So he's speaking about what is the point of humanity? What is the role of humanity? I want to say real quickly too, this book was written in 1962. And so there's a lot of man language and he language. He's not using gender neutral language here, but he's speaking about humanity as a whole. I just wanted to say that because he literally refers to humanity, the entire book, as man, and that's just a product of it being written in the 60s. But to get back, this paragraph is speaking about this beautiful part that man is humanity is created essentially to bless God. And when he uses this language of bless, it's to connect everything that one does back to God. God has given us the food. God has given us this beautiful day. God has given us our neighbors who we are to care for. God has given our neighbors who care for us. And what happens is throughout life, we start not to make those connections and we stop blessing, as he calls it. The language bless we could think about other words that might fit in there, but his point is we stop doing that. And when we stop doing that, we stop connecting God to everything. So Betsy talked about sin as separation. And so we start separating everything from God. We start saying, oh, well, God's not involved in this. And God's not involved in that. And what Smayman is lifting up is that instead, we are to be priests in the sense that we are to bless everything. We are to connect everything to God. And in that way, it becomes a Eucharist. And the Eucharist, as a religious institution, as a sacrament, at its core, the Eucharist is from the Greek word Eucharisto, which means to bless. And so we're blessing right in that act. And so he's trying to draw us back into this world where we go out and the world is alive with God. And it's alive with God and communing with God because we recognize that. And in our recognition, we bless it. We make those things holy is another way to think about it. So I'm interested now to hear your thoughts on this point, what questions you have. And does this seem confusing? Does it seem weird to bless everything? Do you not agree that we are to be priests? Yeah, what do y'all think here? You guys are very quiet for a book group.
Well.
Yep. Bill, then Faye.
For me, it is a powerful image and invitation. As Sybil has mentioned, I very much resonate with Richard Rohr. I think it is little actualized. Thinking of sin as alienation. This nation is so alienated right now that I think there is much that works against this holistic, that would be one of my words, that all of creation, God is present in. And I think how that would shape how we would respond globally, nationally, and individually to people in need. If we see everyone as a child of God, every part of creation as, when God finished creation, he said, it is good. So it's powerful, it's energizing. I think it is little actualized.
Thanks. That's a great point. You said it's energizing, and that's the kind of feeling I get when I read this. It makes me want to kind of not keep a kind of defined limitation on my faith, but rather to live in this way that is energized, that sees God in all things. Faye?
I'm in 100%. I think all of that is true in the way I try to live my life, and it really activates your life intellectually and spiritually. Yeah, it's a good thing, and not always an easy practice.
It's not easy at all, and I think that's the point of the priest, right? Is that it's a responsibility bestowed upon us, and we'll talk some about the difference between Orthodoxy and our Reformed tradition. But we do have a belief in the priesthood of all believers. And I think that's something that we don't lift up enough, is that you, not me, who's the ordained pastor, but you have a responsibility just as much, that you are God-given talents to carry out and to live out day in, day out. Dennis?
Well, I think it's appreciation. I'm looking out my window. I see the sun shining on the trees. There are breezes blowing. I saw a pelican fly by and a great white heron. And it's just seeing God's nature and appreciating everything. When the food is put on the table, a lot of times we say the blessing, but not thinking of it. This is a Eucharist. God has given us a Eucharist of all that we see. And it's just really energizing to look at it that way, as everything that we say or do is part of God.
Thanks. That's a great point, Dennis. I appreciate you adding to this conversation. Yeah, when you were talking, Dennis, I was thinking about other words we could use for bless, and praise came up, right? We could praise God when we go outside and see all the beautiful things that you just listed. Another one is rejoice, right? And that's a great biblical word that shows up a lot in the Psalms, is to rejoice. Those are kind of words that would be interchangeable with with bless, rejoice, praise. Oh, go ahead, Marcia.
I'm wondering if you could use thanks also. One of the spiritual disciplines I'm working on is trying to live out in everything, give thanks.
Yep.
And more calling back my consciousness to good, bad, or indifferent. Thank you, Lord.
That's another one. So we'll have bless, praise, rejoice, and give thanks. And those all sound like good disciplines for Lent. Another thing I want to draw up now that we're talking about this is, I said this is kind of Smayman's anthropology. He's speaking about what man is, what humanity is, and what humanity is for. And I think we're moving from desire to kind of purpose, right? But it's really, really important to point out he's not speaking about beliefs as an intellectual doctrine we have to assent to. He's not saying, for humanity to be living a full life, they have to believe X, Y, and Z. It's much more an orientation and a way a life is lived. And that's really key to what Smayman's going to be dragging at. That doesn't mean that doctrine or dogma doesn't have a point, but I think it's that it's secondary or tertiary, and living a full life is primary. Eleanor?
I was just going to say, the one line that I love is that it says, but the unique position of man in the universe is that he alone is to bless God for the food and the life he receives from him. you know, just that we've been given this gift. We're not just like the other creatures on the planet. We have a gift as humans that we have that connection. And I just think I thought that was beautiful, that we can love God and bless him back, you know.
Yes, yes. And that loving and that blessing becomes a communion with God. It relates us and connects us to God. And it's an act that we carry out for creation in its whole. Because if we treat creation as profane, it becomes profane, right? We don't care for it. We don't steward it. But if we do care for it and steward it, it becomes something that would be sacred in its entirety. Thanks. So I want to move now to when Smayman covers the fall. And so let's go to page 23. And I'll be reading this quote right here. The world is a fallen world because it has fallen away from the awareness that God is all in all. I'm going to read that again. The world is a fallen world because it has fallen away from the awareness that God is all in all. So when we compartmentalize or when we say this is sacred and that's profane, the accumulation of this disregard for God is the original sin that blights the world. And even the religion of this fallen world cannot heal or redeem it, for it has accepted the reduction of God to an area called sacred, spiritual, supernatural, as opposed to the world as profane. It has accepted the all-embracing secularism, which attempts to steal the world away from God. And then if you go to the bottom of this page of 23, I'm going to read a little more than I quoted, but if you have your book, it starts at the bottom of 23. The natural dependence of man upon the world was intended to be transformed constantly into communion with God, in whom is all life. Man was to be the priest of a Eucharist offering the world to God, and in this offering, he was to receive the gift of life. So that's our responsibility. And in return, we get the fullness of life. We get the abundance of a relationship with God. But because of moving away from that, we have the fall, right? We have sin. So I'm going to jump to page 25 and read. Eleanor, would you read this quote?
In our perspective, however, the original sin is not primarily that man has disobeyed God. The sin is that he ceased to be hungry for him and him alone, ceased to see his whole life depending on the whole world as a sacrament of communion with God. The sin was not that man neglected his religious duties. The sin was that he thought of God in terms of religion, i.e., opposing him to life. The fall is not that he preferred the world to God, distorted the balance between the spiritual and material, but that he made the world material, whereas he was to have transformed it into life in God, filled with meaning and spirit.
Thank you, Eleanor. So this is another important part, and he's making, so we've talked about desire, we've talked about anthropology, and now we're talking about sin and the fall. And the fall is a move away from the awareness of God in all things. And sin, he says, is not disobeying God. And I think that's how most of us would talk about it, right? We've disobeyed God. We haven't fulfilled what we were supposed to do, right? He says, instead, the sin is that he ceased to be hungry for him and for him alone, for God and God alone, ceased to see his whole life depending on the whole world as a sacrament of communion with God. The fall is not that he preferred the world to God, distorted the balance between the spiritual and material, but that he made the world material. What he's saying here is that there isn't a heavenly world or a spiritual world that we're supposed to be a part of in the created world, but rather the created world is both and. It is material and it is spiritual. And in that world, the world which we exist, is a world that we are to carry out our faith, our duties as priests. And what the fall is, what original sin is not living up to that duty. For humanity not to be blessing, not to be praising, not to be rejoicing, not to be giving thanks. Because when we do not do those things, we do not commune, we do not connect with God. And when we don't connect with God, we do not have life as it is meant to be lived. So I'm interested your thoughts on this idea of sin and the fall, and does that jive with how you see sin in the fall, or was this new to you, or do you disagree with it?
Well, I think as it relates to sin, at least in how I was picturing it, and in my mind, sin was kind of thought of as, being selfish, maybe. So this was just a new way, I think, of looking at it, and really, I guess it could kind of tie in, but it's the theme of what I read, and my take on it was everything is, you can't take these things for granted. You can't take your daily meals, your daily interactions with other people, just what is going on around you in the world for granted. Otherwise, that is, at least as what is in this book, that's a sin. That's not what we're supposed to be doing.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It isn't how we kind of, or at least how many of us were brought up to think about sin. I think in the West, especially in Western Protestantism and in Catholicism too, there's this kind of guilt with sin, right? We're guilty because we didn't do these things, or because we did specific things that we're not supposed to. And Smayman's lifting up something much more broad and much more cosmic in its scope. It's essentially that Christ, or I should say God, has laid out a specific form of life for us, and we have chosen, getting back to Barbara's definition of faith, we have chosen not to live life in that way. Any other thoughts on Smayman's discussion of the sin or the fall?
Well,
yes, Dave.
I like to think of sin in a different way from fall. I like to think of it, the analogy of being outside the garden. We're no longer in the garden. We're not really doing bad things or anything. We're outside, and we know we're outside, and we have a longing to go back.
Thanks. And I think Smayman would kind of respond in a way, that's by our own doing, and we can correct that by turning towards blessing, turning towards giving thanks. And in that, we can start to see God's presence in all things.
Will?
Yes, Sybil?
As I was thinking about this as relating to the fall and the activities that are around the fall, it also has to do with eating. And
yeah,
as I'm thinking about it, I didn't see how it relates, but it seems that the sin is that humans took it upon themselves to eat something different, that the food that God was offering, they somehow thought, oh, this will taste better. This will be better. I'll choose for myself what I'll eat instead of, and that breaks the communion. It breaks the Eucharist that God is offering. So that's where my mind is right at the moment about the fall.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. It's like going to a guest house and not eating the food that they made for you, right? It's like, oh, you know what? You made this nice meal for me, but I'm going to go down the street to McDonald's. It's turning away the gift that's been offered. And when you turn that gift away, you turn away the communion with your host. You give up on participating in a shared meal. Well, I want to move us to Christ, because we're getting toward the end of our time together. And so we have desire, the anthropology, right? What's the role of humanity? We just talked about the sin and the fall. And so we move now to how is this corrected, or not? Well, that I shouldn't say corrected, because Smayman explicitly says it's not a correction. So on page 26, I'm reading from this quote, "In this scene of radical unfulfillment, God acted decisively. Into the darkness where man was groping toward paradise, he sent light. He did not do so as a rescue operation to recover lost man. It was rather for the completing of what he had undertaken from the beginning. God acted so that man might understand who he really was and where his hunger had been driving him. So this is from what Robert was reading earlier. And Robert, I believe you have the older copy, so the page numbers might not match up. But this next quote, we believe as well that Christ is present in any seeker after the truth. Again, Smayman is trying to make a point here, and he's quoting Paul Clark's favorite in that quote, Simone Weil, that this isn't about a specific religion. This is life as life is, because God created life. God didn't create specific religious rituals, as opposed to this is a form of life that we are to take part in. And Christ is the offering, the connection, the one that inaugurates this life. So Sybil, I wonder if you would read this next quote from page 27.
Okay. Nowhere in the New Testament, in fact, is Christianity presented as a cult or as a religion. Religion is needed where there is a wall of separation between God and man. But Christ, who is both God and man, has broken down the wall between man and God. He has inaugurated a new life, not a new religion.
Thanks, Sybil. So we're moving from the fall to Christ, and Christ is the one that pulls us out of the fall. And it's really important. Smayman says this isn't to correct something, but rather to complete something. And that's a minor point, but it's a large point, because Smayman is getting rid of the guilt and the issue of this being something we should just sit and sulk in, but rather the point isn't to sulk in what's been done, but rather to say in Christ is offered a connection back to that original intent of God, that in Christ we can live fully these lives as priests, as people who bless, as people who give thanks, as people who praise, as people who rejoice. And so Christ comes into the world to reconnect us to God, and Christ reconnects us in a way that is not a religion, but rather a life. Now that could be a whole nother conversation about what's the difference here between how he's using religion or not. And I'll just make this quick point. Religion is not bad, but religion is not the end. The end is relationship with God. And so religion should be a means to get us into that relationship. And ultimately, that's what Christ is doing. Robert Mims.
We read this book, this for the class. We read this book in our study previously. So that's why, and I have an older copy. So that's why I was out of sync with the timing.
No worries.
The pages are very different. Some of you came from a tradition of Catholicism, or your Episcopals, or your Baptists, the Church of God. I was just always raised a Presbyterian. And so my take on communion or the Eucharist is strictly what I got at Palmacia Pres. Chapter 2, I loved about this book. So I'm commending to you to look carefully at 2, depending on what your background is, and what I thought it was beautiful.
Robert is again ahead of us. He's always ahead of us.
2 isn't the Eucharist?
No, it is. I'm just saying we're not there yet.
Oh, well, it's next week, right?
I know. I'm just playing around.
Yeah, okay.
Any last minute thoughts on this section on Christ and Christ's role? Okay, well, I want to read real quick the last quote, and then we will close in prayer. We are a little condensed on time because I wanted to give an introduction to Smayman. I promise next week we'll have much more time to discuss the book and not have to rush through it. But let's look at this last quote from your notes right here. The purpose of this book is a humble one. It is to remind its readers that in Christ, life in all its totality was returned to man, given again as sacrament and communion, made Eucharist. And it is to show, be it only partially and superficially, the meaning of this for our mission in the world. And so this is about us as much as about what God is calling us to. And so that's kind of where we're starting. And I'm so grateful that y'all joined today. I look forward to next week. Everyone has been commended by Robert to read chapter 2, the Eucharist. So I trust that you all will. If you haven't gotten a book, please call. There should be plenty now because I ordered extra. I want to close with a favorite prayer of mine from Lent, and that is the Lenten prayer of St. Ephrem the Syrian. So I'll just ask you to join me. You can keep yourself muted, but please read out loud this prayer together. O Lord and Master of my life, the spirit of idleness, despondency, ambition, and vain thoughts give me not, but rather a spirit of chastity, humble-mindedness, patience, and love bestow upon me, thy servant. Yea, O Lord King, grant me to see my failings and not condemn my neighbor, for thou art holy unto the ages of ages. Amen. Thank y'all so much for joining me, and we'll see you next week for chapter 2.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.